So next up is, in our Asia Trend series, is the public lecture. As you see here, are here today and tomorrow, Transnational Domestic Workers in Asia. And this is a lecture which will bring us up to date as to what's happening as far as transnational domestic workers is concerned. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates that if you exclude children and count just the number of domestic workers, there are 53 million domestic workers worldwide, of which most are women. About 83% would be women, so overwhelmingly female in its makeup. And since the 1970s in particular, domestic work has truly gone transnational, as we all know in Singapore. I mean, I think there's been many surveys of Singaporean families, and when asked how long can you survive without your domestic worker, the answer ranges from 1 day to 1 week, right? So that's how dependent we are on domestic work, workers from abroad. And so this particular presentation in this public lecture will discuss trends in transnational domestic worker migration, and particularly also the significance of the recent ILO Convention 189 that has been ratified, and this is the Domestic Worker Convention. The speaker for this public lecture is Dr. Maruja Asis. We call her Mala, and Mala would be delivering this lecture that will also reflect on the recent trends as well as possibilities to realize decent work for all domestic workers, including migrant domestic workers. Mala is herself someone who has been in the field for a long while. She is director and Director Research and Publications at the Scalabrini Migration Center in Manila. She is a sociologist by training and has for a very long while been working on international migration and social change in Asia. She's also co-editor of the well-known Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, an academic journal. And so Mala is a major figure both on the ground as well as in academia on migration issues. She also tells me that she has stage experience as well, and the role that she remembers most was to play the part of a domestic worker, and it was a non-speaking role, except that she had to, the only word that she had to say is she had to scream and run across the stage. That was Mala in her role as a domestic worker. So since those days, she's moved on to research on domestic worker issues. And so she's here today to bring us up to date on issues of the decent work agenda in Asia. So Mala.
Thank you very much, Brenda. You forgot one more detail. In my other stage play, I worked as a sugarcane worker. Good evening to all. First of all, I'd like to thank the Asian Research Institute for inviting me. It's really an honor to be part of this 3-in-1 event. I'd also like to thank, of course, NTUC for hosting this event. And thank you very much for your presence. I think what we have just seen is really a very inspiring film and a very inspiring example of a domestic worker who started out from very modest circumstances, and she was not only able to help support her family while she was working here in Singapore as a domestic worker, but she also contributed a lot to her community. And actually that very inspiring example reminds us that it's really possible for people to achieve their dreams. But it was also a situation, it's also a dream come true for her that was made possible also because I would imagine, first of all, that she had a very good working and living conditions. And I think the support that was given by the family of Sarah was really instrumental in helping her achieve decent work conditions, decent working and living conditions that enabled her to have good wages, rest days, rest hours, and enabled her also to achieve more than what she was, more than just a worker. She was able to do something for her family and do something for her community. And hers was also a very good example, and probably one of the rare good examples of somebody who returned home after a temporary stint as a migrant worker, temporary migrant worker, and it is the stuff that countries of origin like the Philippines and Indonesia dream of, that when their workers return home from abroad, they are also able to integrate very well in their own societies and really return home for good. No? Because for many, many migrant workers, including large numbers of domestic workers, sometimes it's an eternal cycle of returning to the place of to another country, or to continue working in the same country, so that they would be able to achieve their dreams. I think I'd also like, by the way, to congratulate the filmmakers and the producers of that film, because this is one message that needs to be heard. No? It was possible for her to have decent working conditions, but those conditions are things that are not given. Those conditions are things that we all can contribute to, so that people can also have a good life, no? And it's not only for the employers, but for everyone concerned. And along this line also of recognizing the work and the contributions of domestic workers, I had this experience sometime in June when a colleague of mine forwarded a copy of a recently completed master's thesis that was submitted to the University of Washington. The thesis was actually about Filipino factory workers in Taiwan, and that was one of the reasons why this colleague forwarded this thesis to me, because it's about migrant workers. But what struck me about that thesis, aside from being good, I was drawn really to the unusual but moving dedication, which read, "To Susanti, who cared for my grandfather in his final days." So I was very curious. I wrote to the author, Peter Soon, and told him that his expression of appreciation of Susanti's work was very touching, especially because this kind of work often goes unappreciated. He kindly answered my query why he wrote that dedication, and he gave me permission to quote him. And he said, "I dedicated my thesis to Susanti because she represents, as you mentioned, the profound yet largely ignored contributions of domestic workers and other types of migrant workers. Susanti, who is from Indonesia, is a single mom with 2 children. Although I have not yet had the chance to meet her, my mother describes her as follows. Susanti is like an angel sent from God. She treated my dad as her own, for her father passed away at around age 50 while she was working in Macau. The way that she took care of my dad touched my heart deeply. I did not love my dad as much as she did. Her love inspires me. Now she treats me as her only relative in Taiwan. The way she holds me and kisses me always puts me on the verge of tears." So this was an email that Peter sent to me sometime in July. So again, for me, this kind of sentiment, particularly from an employer's perspective, is something that we often do not hear about. But I guess it is something that all of us really have to recognize, because domestic work is the kind of work that is typically devalued and always invisible to the public eye. But it is work that is necessary to maintain human life. It is easy to see the work performed by teachers, doctors, policemen, and women, scientists, factory workers, and many other types of workers who produce goods, ideas, and services. These are the so-called productive work. It is less easy to appreciate and value the work needed to enable productive workers to perform their roles. The everyday work of preparing food, cleaning the house, taking care of the young and the sick and the elderly, these are dismissed as unskilled work, particularly if they are performed by foreign migrant workers. And as mentioned earlier, domestic work is an important source of livelihood for women and girls with which they are able to support their families. Historically, this was the case. It is true today. And barring a gender role revolution and institutional change, domestic work is likely to employ women and girls in the foreseeable future. Since the 1970s, domestic workers have increasingly included foreign or transnational domestic workers. In the more developed countries such as Singapore and Taiwan, domestic work has been outsourced or passed on to foreign domestic workers as more and more local women join the paid labor market. Destination countries aim to reduce the dependency on less skilled foreign workers, while origin countries also aspire to reduce the less less skilled workers they send abroad. But this goal is unlikely to be realized. For one, domestic work has fallen into the 3D jobs in more developed countries, which locals are shying away from. And the aging of the population in the developed countries will have major implications for the demand for transnational workers. So with these key conclusions, I would now like to turn to some details behind these general observations. In the first part of my presentation, I will be presenting an overview of trends in the migration of transnational domestic workers, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. Based on a survey that was conducted by the ILO among its 177 member countries, they estimated that there are at least 53 million domestic workers in the world. So if they are concentrated in one country, that would be like the population of Myanmar. So you can also imagine that the population of domestic workers all over the world is like the population of Singapore, 10 times over. This is really a very conservative figure because the number could be twice as high, about 100 million. And data confirm that indeed domestic work is mostly an occupation involving women and girls. The Asia-Pacific region is home to 41% of the world's domestic workers. So that translates to about 21.5 million individuals engaged in domestic work. Until the 1970s, domestic workers were local, although many of them were migrants whose roots are in the rural areas. Thus, before international migration surged, young women were migrating to urban areas where many of them land employment as domestic workers. The migration of women to take up domestic work extended into international migration, beginning in the 1970s when international migration started in our region. The start of international migration and the rise of tiger economies actually went hand in hand. But the role of international migration in attaining the so-called East Asian economic miracle has not always been recognized. As the economies of Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore took off, at some point they had to resort to labor migration to meet the need for workers in the various sectors which ceased to be attractive to local workers. Later, Malaysia and Thailand also required migrant workers for their agricultural, construction, and manufacturing sectors. The road to economic transformation in these countries also involved the participation of women in labor migration, which was largely driven by the demand for domestic workers in the tiger economies, except in the cases of Japan and Korea. So that's another story. The heavy concentration of women migrants in domestic work is quite distinctive in our region, leading some scholars to comment on the highly gendered migration patterns in Asia, where male migration is largely a response to the need for workers in the formal sectors of the economy, while female migration is specifically the transfer of reproductive labor or care work from local women to migrant women. The major destinations of transnational domestic workers are Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia. Thailand also receives many domestic workers from the neighboring countries, largely from Myanmar, and some from Cambodia and Laos, but their migration has generally been undetected because it is outside the legal channels. Indonesia and the Philippines are the major source countries of domestic workers. Both countries provide domestic workers beyond East and Southeast Asia, particularly to the Middle East. The large share of migrant domestic workers is the main reason for their very highly feminized migration profiles. The share of women migrants among Philippine migrants has gone down a little bit, but it has remained quite high for Indonesia up to this day. Vietnam and more recently Cambodia have also emerged as source countries of domestic workers in East and Southeast Asia. Then as now, the concentration of women migrants in domestic work has been met with much ambivalence. On the one hand, it is great that mobility and access to livelihood are not closed off to women. But because domestic work is not recognized as work, concerns are rife about the well-being of women migrants. The problems that they face have remained painfully the same over the years, suggesting the systemic nature of these challenges. It starts from exorbitant placement fees, contract substitution, harsh working conditions, no days off, substandard wages, delayed or non-payment of wages, physical abuse, verbal abuse, violence against women, so forth and so on. So a crucial step towards ensuring basic protection of domestic workers, both local and transnational, is the recognition of domestic work as work. There is nothing inherently dangerous about domestic work. No? It renders people who work in this particular sector vulnerable because it is not recognized as work and therefore it is not protected by national labor laws. The protection of domestic workers, therefore, presents more challenges because of multiple, especially in the case, rather, of transnational domestic workers, because of multiple sources of marginalization. Domestic work is not valued. It is performed by women who are foreign. They come from poor countries. They work in private households and are therefore rendered invisible. When we turn to the governance of domestic worker migration in the region, we see that there had been changes over the years. But initially, when labor migration started, countries of origin and countries of destination subscribed to a very national migration policy framework, each pursuing its own interests. So, for example, countries of origin were typically interested in finding labor markets for their nationals, while destination countries were keen in accessing workers. Among the destination countries or territories in East and Southeast Asia, Hong Kong is the only one which recognizes domestic work as work. As such, the employment of foreign domestic workers is governed by a contract which specifies a monthly minimum wage, working hours and days off, and statutory holidays. Taiwan also has a legislated monthly wage, but the challenge in Taiwan is the very steep placement fees. Okay. In January 2013, Singapore made headways by requiring a day off for domestic workers per week. So this is one victory, which is attributed, of course, to many years of lobbying and advocacy. In general, thus, the national policy framework that defines the work conditions of transnational domestic workers in the region is not a pretty picture. It's a rather bleak picture. Countries of origin have attempted to develop various interventions to enhance the protection of migrant domestic workers. Among these initiatives are training programs to provide departing migrant workers with skills and basic language, based on the idea that if they are skilled, they are less likely to be vulnerable. Countries of origin have also developed pre-departure information programs, again, to orient departing migrant workers with what they can expect in terms of working and living conditions while they are abroad. They have also endeavored to provide facilities and service for migrant workers in countries of destination where they have large concentrations of their nationals. These efforts, however, are not sufficient. They need to be complemented and reinforced by measures and interventions by governments, employers, the migration industry, civil society organizations, and communities on the destination side. A peculiar feature of migration in Asia, which has a lot of bearing on the protection of transnational workers, is the participation of the private recruitment agencies. The irregular practices of recruitment agencies, in fact, have been identified as a primary source of the vulnerabilities and risks faced by migrant workers, beginning with irregular practices at the point of recruitment. The steep recruitment fees or placement fees charged by recruitment agencies for their mediation services is a key factor initiating the spiral of abuses committed against transnational domestic workers. Some require upfront payments, which means that families of migrant workers have to incur a heavy debt even before they leave their own countries. Others exact payments through salary deductions. So imagine not receiving your salary, the full amount of your salary for 6 months, 8 months, and some for even as long as 10 months. This condition, therefore, hostages migrant women. They are already indebted before they even begin working, and they are forced to remain in harsh working and living conditions abroad in order to repay their debts. The thing also is that if they run away from very abusive conditions, then they are considered as runaway workers and are considered as irregular or illegal migrant workers in the eyes of the governments of destination countries. Recruitment agencies in the countries of origin, along with their counterparts in the destination countries, can even also impose additional demands in order to discipline workers. So, for example, recruitment agencies have been known to advise employers not to give domestic workers a day off until after the latter has paid off her placement fee. Also, recruitment agencies have been known to check the workers' luggage before their departure for their overseas assignments and to confiscate the workers' cell phones, because cell phones can be a powerful means of communication and they can access support and services if they need to. Even the way that workers dress, domestic workers in particular, or even the length of their hair can be dictated by recruitment agencies. The plight of transnational domestic workers has spurred the emergence of civil society organizations to address gaps in support services and to sustain the lobbying and advocacy for migrants' rights. The presence of CSOs and many faith-based organizations in a country of destination like Hong Kong, for example, has also contributed to relatively better conditions for domestic workers. Many domestic workers would consider actually Hong Kong as the best destination country, for the reasons that have been cited. In response to the challenges of international labor migration, and in particular the migration of women, we have also seen, following a number of developments, which also inspire some confidence. So not everything is bad news. So some developments have actually taken place. One of these, for instance, is the opening up towards regional cooperation. Labor migration is a regulated process in the region, with countries of origin and countries of destination developing policies and infrastructures to regulate the different phases of migration. However, the regulation is mostly limited to regulating the movement of workers. So the kind of regulation that we hope to see more in the future is really the regulation that is focused also on monitoring the working and living conditions of migrant workers, especially transnational domestic workers. Nonetheless, we've seen that since the 1990s, there had been some notable steps towards bilateral and regional cooperation on labor migration. Also a lot more, at least regional discussions on this particular issue. Countries in East and Southeast Asia are part of regional consultative processes such as the Bali process, the Colombo process, and of late, the Abu Dhabi process. Specific to the ASEAN is the framing of the 2007 ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers, which is an important step towards a regional perspective of protecting workers. Of course, a lot more work is needed to really fill in the details and to give life and meaning to these processes and instruments, but at least we have some starting point there. The other positive development also is the emergence of self-organized migrants associations and organizations. As mentioned earlier, civil society organizations, including faith-based organizations, have emerged as an important stakeholder in migration discussions in the region, primarily playing a key role in the rights deficit environment. But significant to note is the development of organizations formed by migrants themselves. A bright spot on the horizon is the formation of migrant domestic workers' unions. Again, the example that we have here is the case of Hong Kong, where several migrant workers' unions have been formed among Indonesians, among Filipino domestic workers there, and even an alliance of these migrant workers' organizations along with the Hong Kong Trade Unions Congress. We are very much encouraged by this development because it demonstrates that domestic workers who are generally perceived as unorganizable can actually be organized. But again, in this regard, of course, I would caution that it also depends on the employers. Because, for example, if the employers don't even give a day off to their domestic workers, then there's even no way that domestic workers can even meet other people for support, much less to organize and mobilize amongst themselves. Another positive development that we are seeing is also more cooperation and more synergy between migrant-related NGOs and trade unions. For a very long time, trade unions have not really been that active in the advocacy for migrants' rights, because there was also this notion, of course, among trade unions that migrant workers are competitors to local workers. But there has been a change. No? There has been a change, particularly in our region, about the attitude of trade unions. The synergy of migrant NGOs and trade unions was, for example, a very critical component in the broad-based preparation, mobilization, and finally the adoption of Convention 189. This synergy will continue to be important in the campaign for ratification and the enforcement of Convention 189. And perhaps this is my bias as a researcher. No? In reviewing what went on in the making of Convention 189, the reports on the conditions of domestic workers provided by NGOs, trade unions, migrant NGOs, academics, human rights groups, and international organizations such as the ILO, these really provided a lot of evidence-based data and information on the actual conditions of domestic workers, which brought to light the long overdue need to consider domestic work as work and for domestic workers to be protected like other workers. The fourth development is something that maybe many stakeholders are taking with some dose of skepticism, but nonetheless, I'd like to mention that even in the recruitment industry, they're also showing some signs of getting involved in the protection of migrant workers. Normally, recruiters are seen as the villains, no? The classical villains in the migration narrative. But among the more notable trends are discussions in the industry about code of ethics. I'm not sure about the situation here in Singapore, but for example, in the Philippines, several recruitment agency associations, they have formed some kind of a movement, and they have a memorandum of agreement with the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration committing to ethical recruitment. Okay? So notably, civil society organizations are looking at this development with some skepticism, as I had mentioned earlier. They're wondering what is the real story behind this. But nonetheless, perhaps, again, it is also a very good start that they are giving due attention to the welfare of migrant workers. Let me return a little bit to the adoption of Convention 189, the Domestic Workers Convention, ILO Domestic Workers Convention, and why it is significant in the work of protecting domestic workers. Adopted on June 16, 2011, at the 100th International Labour Conference in Geneva, Convention 189 had arousing 396 voting for approval, 16 against, and 63 abstentions. So the numbers of members that voted for the approval is really quite big, no? 396. There were 32 countries in the Asia-Pacific, including the Arab states and Central Asia, that voted in favor of the convention. 3 countries abstained. When we come also to the accompanying recommendations, recommendations 201, again, the support for it was very massive, 434 votes of approval, 8 against, and 42 abstention. Why is this convention important? Among others, it really codifies and provides for the following. It defines who is a domestic worker. Okay? And the ILO Convention defines a domestic worker as any person who works in or for a household or households within an employment relationship. That's why a work contract is very important in this regard. It also specifies the obligations of member states. Among others, this would including domestic workers in their labor laws, providing domestic workers with the same minimum labor rights and protection as all other workers, equal treatment of domestic workers, right to social security and maternity leave, among others, rest days, wages, and so forth. It also requires that domestic workers must be covered by unemployment contracts, just so that the employer and the employee or the worker knows what are the obligations and responsibilities that each one have to bear in this particular working relationship. And another important provision is giving domestic workers the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. The first two countries to ratify the instrument were Uruguay and the Philippines. Uruguay ratified it on June 14, 2012, and the Philippines on September 5. This particular convention needed at least two countries to ratify it before it can be enforced. And the practice is once the second ratification has been deposited with the ILO, then it will take a year in which this convention can therefore be enforced. So that means that the convention will be enforceable on September 5, 2013, a year after the second ratification was deposited. To date, 11 countries have ratified the convention. 6 in Latin America, namely Uruguay, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, and Colombia. 2 in Africa, Mauritius and South Africa. 2 in Europe, Italy and Germany, and 1 in Asia, which is the Philippines. What this also entails is that if a country ratifies this convention, then it means that it has to have also national laws that would be in conformity with the provisions of C-189. And so I'm happy to report that when the Philippines finally passed the domestic workers law, it was enacted in January of this year, and it was enforced in June of this year. No? So that is one of the advantages of ratifying an international instrument, because then there is an international standard to which ratifying states will have to comply with. For an international instrument to have teeth, it has to be ratified by many countries, because the strength of an international instrument is that it is then binding to the state parties to abide by the provisions of the convention. The campaign is going to be long and hard. As I've mentioned, so far only 11 countries have ratified it, and in Asia, maybe the challenge is especially enormous, because there's really a lot of work that has to be done. So far, we've only had one ratification here. So it's going to be long and hard, and the campaign will have to work at chiseling away long-held notions about domestic work being unskilled, being insignificant, work that cannot be defined, or work that cannot be monitored. The advocacy at the international level is one thing, but for an international instrument such as the C-189 to have an impact on the lives of domestic workers, global efforts, of course, have to be complemented by actions at all levels: regional, national, local, and where we are. So it would also involve many stakeholders: governments, employers, the private sector, communities. And we all have a role to play in exploring all the spaces and fora that are available to ensure that domestic workers are not marginalized. If we look at the future agenda, what does it bode? Okay. Well, if we actually have just governments to have their say, if governments had their way, they would prefer to have more skilled and professional migrants over less skilled migrants, including domestic workers. As I mentioned earlier, origin countries aspire to send more professional workers, and destination countries also to aim to bring in more skilled and professional workers to maintain their competitive edge. In the coming ASEAN Economic Community, okay, that's 2 years down the line, okay, the blueprint only speaks of the free flow of skilled labor and is silent on the issue of less skilled workers. This actually may not be realistic, particularly if we consider our demographic future. Of course, there are many things that we can think about, but somehow the issue of demographics is very important for us to consider. The onset of aging and fertility decline has already started in the more developed countries in the region, while the less developed countries continue to grapple with the immense challenge of providing employment for their relatively young populations. Population data for selected countries in the Asia-Pacific suggests how the demographic divide between countries of origin and countries of destination can reveal our interdependence rather than, the differences that we have, our interdependence on each other. What are some of the things that the data reveal? Fertility decline has definitely set in, as indicated by total fertility rate of less than 2.1. Basically, countries in East Asia have reached, at least the 4 East Asian countries that we considered, like Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, and China included, they have below replacement fertility level. The situation is more variable in Southeast Asia. Singapore and Thailand and Vietnam are already below replacement level, while the rest, most of which are sending countries, have not yet reached this particular level. So the momentum for the latter countries to grow is still very much present. In general, also, we're looking at life expectancy, which indicate that people in the more developed economies can expect to live longer. What is interesting is one of the data that is presented by for the Asia Pacific, which is presented by ESCAP, show that in the ESCAP region, there are 8 people supporting 1 elderly person. No, this is the old age ratio support. In East Asia, this declines to 6, while it is still a bit high in Southeast Asia, 10. No? What this means is that in Southeast Asia in general, there are 10 people in the ages 15 to 64 that is supporting 1 elderly person who is in the age 65 and over. Among the ESCAP countries, Japan has the oldest life expectancy. It also has the largest share of population 65 and up, and it has the lowest old age support. Presently, we are not talking of the future. Presently, only 2.6 persons are supporting 1 elderly person in Japan. Unique also to Japan is the projected decline in its population in 2030. The rest of the countries, at least in East and Southeast Asia, will have population increase, some more than others. In Southeast Asia, Singapore's profile actually seems closer to that of East Asian countries. Compared to other Southeast Asian countries, Singapore has the lowest TFR. According to ESCAP data, 1.4, but according to our friend Muiteng, it's already 1.2 or 1.1. It has the highest life expectancies for men and women. It has the highest share of elderly population at 10%, and it shares with Thailand the lowest ratio of the relatively young supporting the elderly at 7. Thus, population decline coupled with population aging will pose critical challenges in the more developed countries and points to migration as one of several options to meet the need for workers to sustain their economies, and specifically the need for care workers to care for their elderly and aging populations. In turn, migration will help ease the employment challenges in less developing countries and contribute to the support of the families of migrant workers. Our shared future is like one big puzzle where our societies hold a piece needed to complete the puzzle. And in the scheme of things, we all have something to give and receive. When we come down to specifics, international instruments such as the C-189 remind us of our responsibility to each other and how that shared responsibility can also empower our own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mala, for reminding us of the importance to accord dignity to the work of our hands in domestic work, as well as the interdependence of countries in this particular region. We do have 2 commentators who are going to speak to the issue as well. The first up is Dr. Noorashikin Abdul Rahman. Noor is a long-time board member of Transient Workers Count 2, TWC2, basically, and she is currently the treasurer. She has completed various reports on domestic worker issues, the recent ones being Justice Delayed, Justice Denied, as well as another report on Made to Work, Attitudes Towards Granting Regular Day Offs to Migrant Domestic Workers in Singapore. And so I'll invite her to speak briefly to some of the issues that Mala has already introduced us to. So Noor, please.
Very good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Brenda, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Asia Research Institute, for inviting TWC2 to be a part of this event. Congratulations to Bernice and Eugene for producing a beautiful film, which is just which is just a nice length for educators to show in class and to use it as a point of discussion. Well, my job here today is to give an update on the situation of migrant domestic workers in Singapore, and also offer some insights on whether there have been any major shifts in the employment standards for these workers in Singapore. I think this point has been emphasized by Brenda before. I mean, domestic workers is definitely a significant part of the landscape in Singapore. If you look at the figures, in 1991, it was reported in the Straits Times that there were 71,000 migrant domestic workers in Singapore. When I was writing my thesis in the early 2000s, I think it was estimated that there were about 140 to 150,000. And I think the most recent figures that were reported is that there are now close to 210,000. So migrant domestic workers are here to stay, and they are not going anywhere. There have been the Philippines and Indonesia still predominantly the most significant source of domestic workers for Singapore. However, more recently there's been an aggressive drive by employment agents to recruit workers from untapped or poorly tapped sources such as Myanmar. Currently, I think there are about 30,000 domestic workers from Myanmar who are in Singapore. I think in July they started recruiting domestic workers from Cambodia, and I think they are also employment agents are also looking towards drumming up sources supply from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and a more recent development is that there have also been male domestic workers that have been recruited recently, and these male domestic workers are from Myanmar, and they have been especially trained to look after the needs of the elderly members of the family who are immobile and need help with daily living. So we can see that live-in paid domestic workers, is seen as to be playing a key solution to the needs of families in Singapore in order to address the challenges and the pressure and the responsibility of taking care of family members who are not able to take care of themselves. Has there been any major shifts in employment standards in the past few years? I guess to answer that question, let's have a look at some of the key changes to rules and regulations pertaining to the recruitment and employment of domestic workers in Singapore. Mala has mentioned this in her speech. The weekly mandatory day off came into force January 2013. It was a short-lived victory, I must say. I will explain later, all right? But that's one key change. The compulsory English test was replaced by a one-day settling-in program. Okay, this is in reaction to a tragic case of an Indonesian domestic worker who hung herself because she failed the English test. So that led to some kind of soul-searching about the value of having such a test, and also incidents of domestic workers who actually fall to their death while doing household chores like hanging the laundry as well as washing windows, that have also led to some soul searching. And what MOM, or the Ministry of Manpower, did was to introduce this one-day settling-in program with the hope of providing a more adequate training and preparation for domestic workers to be able to to work safely and under safe conditions, and to deal with the culture shock of making the move from where they come from to adapt to Singapore lifestyle. I think sending countries, the Indonesian government and the Philippines government, they have also been working hard in trying to address this issue of debt bondage. So they have introduced some new schemes and some new rules to cap the fees that labour suppliers can charge for every domestic worker that they deploy to employment agents. Of course, this wasn't met there was much uproar, especially from employment agents here. So these are some of the key changes, all right? And so do these changes have any impact on the employment standards for domestic workers? The reason why I said the the mandatory day off is a short-lived victory was a report published in the Straits Times in December 2012 stated that they did a survey of among 8 biggest employment agents in Singapore on how employers respond to the idea of giving their domestic workers a weekly day off. And apparently that 70% of their combined 800 customers who are due to be receiving their domestic workers in January 2013 have said that they are not going to give their domestic workers a weekly day off. So they rather they'd rather exchange this for cash. All right, so that's quite bleak. All right. Okay. Now, there's also been reports to show that the retention rate for domestic workers has decreased. All right. What this means is that from October 2000, from February. From February 2008 and February 2010, okay, October 2009 and October 2010, only 42% of the domestic workers who are placed with the employers actually remain with the same employers. All right, and this is a major reduction from previous figures that quoted 47%. So what this shows is that domestic workers are not happy working in Singapore. Okay. And why? There are many factors. And one of them is that if you compare the situation in Singapore and in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, number one is the wages in Hong Kong and in Taiwan are far higher, all right? The starting wages of a domestic worker in Singapore is about $420 to $450, while in Taiwan it's about $700. In Hong Kong it's close to $600. Okay, in Hong Kong too, domestic workers, I think as Mala has told us, they are protected under national labour laws, so they have better employment standards. Okay, I think the survey that was done with employers who are expecting to employ domestic workers and with regards to their attitudes towards granting domestic workers a weekly day off is very telling as to how employers in Singapore prefer to treat domestic workers. So, so that's I would say the update that I have. So, what should be done? Of course, we need to legislate, employment rights. All right, bring domestic workers under national labour laws to provide them better protection, to ensure that they are able, the employment standards for domestic workers in Singapore are able to match up with some of the minimum benchmarks that are set out in C189. But I think we can change legislation, we can improve the process of recruitment and employment, but what needs to be done, what is actually crucial is for us to have a mindset shift, okay, because much of the difficulties that domestic workers face at work is because of the way employers treat them. Okay, so you may have laws, but employers will find ways to circumvent them if they are, or employment agents will also find ways to circumvent them. And I think this is a message that not only the government, but all of us, need to drum into the younger generation and also to ourselves. Perhaps maybe there's a lot of scope given the emphasis now on values and character education in school. So this is probably something that we need to pay attention to. At the same time, I do empathize with families, who are feeling the financial and psychological pressure of having to take on the responsibilities of trying to do the best that they can in order to take care of their dependent elderlies and their less abled family members. So I think there also needs to be more alternatives that are given to them to ensure that they are able to access other forms of paid care services other than actually employing a live-in domestic worker, because as we have seen that a lot of families actually struggle with having the idea of employing a live-in domestic worker, and not all employers are like Sarah. A lot of us actually fail in terms of being fair to our domestic workers. And I think the state needs to help, all right? So they can, there needs to be a shift in terms of how they view money that is spent to support families to access this kind of, to pay for, paid domestic service as well as paid care services, and don't see that these are expenses that are a loss to resources. It is a moral responsibility, and I think if we all work together to ensure that families can render the best care that they can to family members, and also not at the expense of exploiting the dreams of people like Rista, who have very limited opportunities in terms of employment back home. So with that, I end my little talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Noor. And we do have another commentary from a very different perspective. And this is Mr. Anthony Chen, who will come up and speak. Anthony graduated from film school, I think a while ago. I think he's a young man, right? I mean, so can't be a very long time ago, but he graduated, a short time ago, I suppose, and he's graduated Chen Film, which is G23, was screened at multiple festivals worldwide and won various awards. And from those beginnings, he's gone on then to win he had his debut feature film, ILO, that was, as you see here, at the world premiere in the Directors Fortnight section of this year's Cannes Film Festival. And it's won the prestigious Camera d'Or Award. And it is a film about a young child, a boy, I believe, and his mate. I've not seen it myself, so apparently Anthony will introduce us to his film as well, and hopefully relate what this film tells to the story of domestic workers today. So I actually don't know where he is. He is yes, okay, right. So Anthony, all yours, yeah.
Maybe I should just talk a little bit first. I'm not an academic. I'm not from an NGO, so I can say I'm no expert in migrant issues. I'm no expert in domestic worker issues. So what I'm going to share, comes from a very personal place. I'd like to begin by sharing the trailer of the film, because this is where it all begins.
You can call me Terry, Mom. Terry, give me your passport.
刚拿人家 passport。
把它突然跑掉了。
You can see. 喂，
做什么你？我大马蜂。I am your maid. I didn't come here to be bullied. That's enough. Go and do our work, don't be capable. Chandler! Your hair very tall. I help you wash your hair. What? Oi, Chandler! Chandler, stop! Mommy, can Auntie Terry 站这边
Teresa, I'm his mother, not you.
How long have you been out of job for? 2 months. Terry?
Yes.
Tell Mama.
This
整天就会看穿你老公啊！
你不可以脚踏实地一点，安分守己一点。现在什么局势，做什么生意，可以不要讲了吗？
爸爸妈咪有话要跟你说。
你干什么啊？
So this is the film I made. It's my first full-length movie. It's called ILO. The Chinese title is actually called Pa Ma Bu Zai Jia, which translates to Father, Mother Not at Home. Where should I start regarding this film? I think what's interesting is that in Singapore we spend most of our time just growing up. You're just forced to grow up really quickly. You become an adult, you do adult things, and you chase grades, and then you chase a career, and your childhood gets left behind. For me, I think at some point of our lives, your childhood comes back and haunts you. For me, it happened a few years ago, and all these memories of growing up, came back, flooding in my head. I had a domestic helper, when I was growing up. So the story begins with me. I'm a filmmaker. I'm gonna tell you stories through pictures. The story begins with me, and I had a domestic helper. Her name was Teresa. We called her Auntie Terry. She was here when I was 4. She left when I was 12. So she was, working in our household, in our family for 8 years. What's interesting, actually, the thing that kept grinding in my head was that moment when I was 12 and I was in the airport. And I just remember she was going to leave and go home to the Philippines for good, and I just remember I was just crying and crying and crying, and it was so painful. It was so painful. So I have no idea how I could repress that emotion for so long, and it only came back so many years later. So it really began from there. It started with a piece of emotion, and I didn't quite understand what that was. So that's my family. I'm the kid on the left, the eldest in the family. We have 3 boys at home. That's me with the very 90s looking specs. I don't know where did that come from. That's our helper, Auntie Terry, as we call her. She is from ILO. That's where the title of the film actually comes from. It's very interesting. A lot of times your memory is so vague of someone, but there's something that just registers deep in my head. Where she's from, ILO, which is a province in the Philippines. It's such a cute name. I can't see how anyone could forget it. That's her. I always remember her in her red hot jeans. She was so beautiful. She was so young, so youthful. She had very good taste. I remember why I'm talking about this now, because I'm going to talk about what happens later. She has very good taste. I remember she used to listen to, she had all these cassette tapes of Miss Saigon and Evita. So she has good, cultured taste. That's her again. That's her with, at the void deck, these are some of the other helpers from the estate. My youngest brother, who she took care of since she's a baby. It's the kid in the blue uniform on the top left. So I made this film, and it came from a very personal place. I started with this piece of emotion. I went on with it for 2 years writing a script. As I wrote and wrote, that emotion became more and more precise, more and more clear. So the film got selected for Cannes, and when it won this huge award at the Cannes Film Festival, apart from, I think those that have heard of the film, it generated a lot of buzz here, but it created a lot of buzz in the Philippines. It was reported on television. It was reported in the papers. I think we have a huge cult following now in the Philippines with regards to this film. And at that time, I was contacted by a man, a Filipino man who used to work in Singapore for quite a number of years, like 20 over years. And he said he was very moved by the trailer and he wants to help me find Auntie Terry. I've not seen her for 16 years. Basically, we lost touch because we moved house. So I thought, okay. The thing is, I don't remember. I don't know her full name. We don't know much of the details. So it really started with our address in Singapore, our names, the names of the children, and a few of these pictures that you see. I thought, okay, Philippines is huge, right? You have 90 million people. I was thinking, this would probably take like 6 months, a year before you could find someone like that. So I didn't know how big he's going to take this. So it was splashed in papers, it was on the radio, it was on television. And 2 weeks later, I got an email. And he said, I think we found Auntie Terry. But we need to verify something. So I had to ask my mom some questions. Because we had to verify that it's the right person, right? But my mom couldn't remember her full name. My mom couldn't remember, a lot of details as well. But one thing she remembered was her birthday. So that was the easiest way. So that was how she was verified. And that's her now when she found her. That's me on the top right hand many, many, many years ago when I was still young. When she left, she was 40. Now she's 56. I think what was very moving was this. When they found her, they saw that she has this pouch that she carries every day. I was told, I don't remember that pouch anymore. I was told that pouch was given by my mum, and she carries it with her every day, and in that pouch it has all our photographs. And a lot of these photographs, our family didn't have them. I myself haven't seen a lot of them. It's really interesting because, she asked the people that found her, like, oh, what do they want with me? I can't work anymore. And they said that, perhaps at one point of your life, you did, something great for them, and now, they want to pay you back a favor. They want to see you again. And she was asked, have you been thinking about them? And then she said, every day I have a million thoughts of them, but I don't expect a single thought of me. It's amazing that she kept, everywhere she goes, she brings this pouch with all these pictures of all of us. That was the reason why she was found a month ago. 3 weeks ago, I actually made a very secret, very low-profile trip to the Philippines, to Iloilo. This is the second time I was going to the Philippines. The first time I went to Manila to cast my actress for the film. This is the second time, and I'm in Iloilo. Why it had to be a very secretive, low-profile trip? Because there was a huge media frenzy in Philippines. Everyone was asking me lots of questions over email. People wanted my phone. Everyone wanted to ask, like, oh, what do you feel about this and all that. And it came so quickly that my family didn't know how to react. On the day we found her, like, it was very emotional. My mom was tearing because of all these pictures that she kept of us. So I made this very low-profile trip, and I met her for the first time again in 16 years. What is very startling for me is her life has changed completely. She used to wear red hot jeans. She used to, have really good, colorful clothes, very fashionable, taste in clothes. She listens to great music. I remember she used to buy all this Aiwa and Sony hi-fis and TVs, and she would ship them home. She would buy lovely presents for us during Christmas. But this is where she lived now. We had to walk through like 20 minutes through a jungle, trek through like a lot of mud. She lives in the countryside now, in a small little place in Iloilo called San Miguel. And she lives in a wooden shed. There is only one light bulb. There's no proper stove. They collect firewood. They make their own charcoal to cook. She has one transistor radio. That's all. There's no pipe water. Basically, it's a old pump. The water isn't that bad because I think it's from a spring. So it's not that bad, but it's not completely safe. And she has only got one light bulb, and the loo, the toilet, is literally like a huge walk away. It's what's startling for me is this: she lives in the worst hut in the whole village. All her brothers actually live around her, and they all had concrete walls. Only her, she had this hut that was made up. Like she sort of half built it herself, I was told. So there were so many questions, I had so many questions in my head. I didn't know what happened, when I was there. I asked her a lot of questions, and she didn't tell me a lot. We had to slowly get a sense of things. She has been sending money back home for the many years she's been working here. What happened to the money? Where did it go to? It funded some of her nephews and niece education. It's interesting that all the other houses where her brothers live, they've got a sofa, a television. She's got nothing. Where she sleeps is just in a small little room above the steps, and she has ducks and chickens just below. She hasn't really have enough money to even eat 3 meals a day. They sell the chickens at the market, not really for money. They sort of, when times are bad, you sort of change it for animal feed. She makes sure that even if she's hungry, she feeds her animals. And sometimes rice, sometimes food. So I had a lot of questions in my head. So a picture of a pig. Why a pig? Because, these very, very kind souls that found her, they asked her, Auntie Terry, we want to do something to help you. If there's anything we can do, what can we do? Is there anything you want? Is there anything you need? And she didn't ask for money. She didn't ask, can I have a house? Can I have, or groceries or anything? She said, can I have a pig? Everyone was very shocked by how humble that request was, and the reason why I want a pig is because, my pigs are very, very old now. They can't breed anymore, and I need a younger pig of a better breed to breed more pigs so that, I can sell them for money. That's all she asked for. We basically brought her out of the village, to stay one night in the hotel with us. This isn't her dress. We bought this dress for her because I realized that she was wearing one of my mom's dress from 16 years ago. So she hasn't been really buying clothes all this time. It's interesting because we had to bring her to the hotel because all the villagers were coming and there was a huge invasion of our own time, and very soon the media is going to come. So we brought her to the hotel room, and what's interesting is, we told her, her and her partner that she lives with, oh, let's meet at 7 for dinner. And, when I came out of my room just before to go down the lift, we were on the 8th floor, and then I just saw the two of them standing outside the lift. And they're just staring and staring at the lift. And then I was trying to figure out why. All these new modern hotels, they've got all these LCD buttons now. And she has forgotten how to press a button. So she was just staring at the lift until I went to press the button, and she's been so detached with modernity. I had a lot of questions in my head. This isn't is this the Auntie Terry that I know? The girl that listens to Miss Saigon and Evita, the girls that buy cassettes and CDs, that buys hi-fi sets and brand new Sony TVs, and he would ship all that back home, that buy all these funky Fisher-Price toys for us. And what was interesting is distress. We went on a bit of a shopping spree. We had to make spectacles for her because she hasn't changed her specs for her glasses for 13 years, and actually both of them weren't seeing well at all. So we went to make glasses for her, and we bought her a dress. And it's very interesting because when she wore this dress, something magical happened. All of a sudden, there was confidence that came back. She started to stand like that. There was something coming back. When they found her, she didn't speak English. And I was told, she has forgotten how to speak English. I was thinking, why would you lose that language altogether? But thank God it wasn't entirely that, because I think she didn't leave the country again, and she didn't had the chance to speak English again until when we came back, the language just came back because she had to speak to us. So it's a very, very emotional trip. It was a very, very dramatic trip. There are a lot of questions in my head. That I had some answers. I didn't have all the answers. I thought it's worth sharing. I'm not here to talk about the film. I'm actually here to talk about what the film actually brought me. It's brought me to many places. Of course, it gave me a huge award. But apart from that, I think it connected me with people from so long ago. So that's a picture of that we didn't have. I think she took it using her own camera. Us three brothers with her. I think it was her birthday, and she's gonna come to Singapore. I think her passport is being processed right now. She's gonna come to Singapore for the first time in 16 years. A Filipino airline has very kindly sponsored her air tickets here, and she's going to attend the Singapore premiere of the film. It's still nerve-wracking for my family. My mom cried and cried and cried when I went back and tell her a lot of stories. But I'll leave you with that. Like I said, I'm not an expert, in policies. I'm not an expert in migrant issues. I'm not an academic. But, what I have comes from a very personal place, and I'm just here to share. Thank you.